All right, so welcome to part 2 of the rise and fall of Christian civilization. This time we're going to talk about Christianity's legacy and the flowering of Western civilization, as it were. So, a couple starting points just so you can pinpoint this in history. The sort of Christian era, the era of the West that's marked by a specific commitment to Christian ideas. The Middle Ages is what it gets called, medieval era, to be less pejorative. That lasts for over 1,000 years. The Middle Ages, medieval era, is roughly, vaguely, 500 to 1500, but this sort of the time in which Christianity is exerting its idea influence over the world is for a couple hundred years longer on either end. So let's say something like this. But these are historical generalizations. Nothing starts and stops in history at any particular point. But in the 4th century is when Christianity becomes legal in the Roman Empire with the first Christian emperor of Rome. And then what happens in the 1800s, the Enlightenment, we'll get to later. But generally speaking, this is the time period that we're talking about, over 1,000 years of what you might call Christian civilization, or at least that's kind of the argument that I'm making. And we need to understand Christianity's accomplishments and influence in this era in terms of the philosophical commitments and paradigm shifts that it introduced into the pagan world that we talked about in the last lecture. So watch that if you haven't, or if you don't remember. So one of the main ones that we talked about was, of course, the concept of the person and that sort of radical human dignity, let's call it, that everybody had. Unlike the sort of relative dignity or really relative value that people had on a pre-Christian notion of what a human being was, not a person in the sense that we're talking about it now. So this human dignity, this concept of human dignity, went on to influence everything else. Then every area of life that suddenly kind of became important for the ancients in a way that it wasn't for the Greco-Roman pagans in the pre-Christian era. Like what, you might ask? Well, hospitals, almsgiving, care of widows and orphans, all of the dispossessed, the lame, the blind, the lepers, there were always institutions. Not really. I was going to say there were always institutions for the dispossessed and for the unfortunate in the ancient world, but there weren't. That's just the reality. They just weren't. There were some things here and there, but it was never made. It was never made a moral obligation to care for these people, let alone any part of the institution's agenda or purview or like the need to take care of the needy. But it was on Christianity. I mean, functionally speaking, it's not an exaggeration to say that the church became the first institution of public welfare in human history. But that's what it was. And it became that way primarily motivated on the basis of its belief in radical human dignity, that everybody, no matter how dispossessed, low-born, or disabled they might be, they were all part of the image of God. And the pagans noted this, actually, and often lamented. Well, there's a famous case in which a pagan emperor lamented how kind and outreach-oriented the Christians were, not just to their own people, which would be normal. The Jews took care of the Jews, the Greeks took care of the Greeks, the Spartans, whatever. But for everybody, regardless of national identity or biological situation, let's say, right? So I have a quote for you. It is also probably wise to recall that the Christians of the early centuries won renown principally for their sobriety, peacefulness, generosity, loyalty to their spouses, care for the poor and the sick, and ability, no matter what their social station, to exhibit virtues. self-restraint, chastity, forbearance, courage, that pagan philosophers frequently extolled but rarely practiced with comparable fidelity. And these Christians, so meaning not just the wealthy practice these kind of virtues, or not just the poor or whatever, right? Every Christian in every station. And these Christians brought something new into the ancient world, a vision of the good without precedent in pagan society, a creed that prescribed charitable service to others as a religious obligation. That is new. The idea that charitable service to others would be a religious obligation is unprecedented in the ancient world. Christianity invented this. A story about a God of self-outpouring love, rather than, of course, a capricious or vindictive one, as in the pagan mythologies. In long retrospect, the wonder of this new nation within the empire is not that so many of its citizens could not really live by the ideals of their faith, nor even simply that so many could, but that anyone could even have imagined such ideals in the first place. Meaning, obviously, not all Christians at this time or ever were perfect moral exemplars. That's not the claim. The claim is that anyone could have even imagined these ideas was unprecedented and sort of impossible before Christianity. Even the Emperor Julian, this is who I was talking about, who was all too conscious of the hypocrisies of which Christians were often capable, because people are people, was forced to lament in a letter to a pagan priest, quote, "It is a disgrace that these impious Galileans," meaning the Christians, "care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well." So that gives you some sense of how, for lack of a better phrase, early Christians turned heads with their care of people and their compassion for people and their religiously motivated obligations to care about other people because of this belief in radical human dignity. And of course, Christianity's influence in this idea made its way into jurisprudence, into laws, and so over many centuries, the laws of the empire began to be less harsh. They did away with brutal practices. They started acknowledging people's, law. Things take time to change, but sure as anything, Christianity's influence slowly and steadily changed the way that ancient people thought about these things, and therefore how they put it into law. So politically things change, culturally things change, because the laws changed in response to these ideas. Okay, so what else developed? A few other things that changed in the Christian era. So one is that there were logical developments. And why is that? Well, I told you we would get to the Trinity later, and in a separate series on Christian theology. But the Trinity and a lot of this theology, how can Christ be both God and man? How can God be both one and three? How does that make sense logically? Well, the need to answer those questions logically drove development in logic. So philosophers learned to make finer and finer distinctions using more and more precise language, more and more sophisticated ways of reasoning. And so that drove and that never stopped, by the way. That just went into the high medieval world, into scholasticism, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, and it drove the development of all kinds of new logic and math too, and logical categories. So that was a very sophisticated development that only happened because of the demands of their theology. So theology actually drove logical developments. That's not the story you hear about the church and its relation to knowledge, right? But it's actually the opposite of pop culture. The pop culture understanding that the church somehow stifled knowledge or anything silly like that. It actually drove the development of logic. And the overturning of pagan astronomy is a big deal. So, you hear, I can only get into this briefly, but you hear this whole weird mythology about how, for centuries the church oppressed scientists, and so it was only after a lot of blood and sweat and tears that they finally overturned the idea of geocentrism, the idea that the sun and all the planets went around the earth, and were able to truly accept that, the heliocentric model, that the earth and the planets went around the sun, and that the church somehow resisted this and all this kind of stuff. This is not true. The Galileo incident that's another story. The short end of it is that Galileo had no proof. He had no mathematical model. He had assertions about stuff, and he was a highly volatile Italian. I mean, he had a big ego, and he got into a gigantic struggle of egos with a bishop, like on a personal level, and it led to all this kind of stuff. Had nothing to do with science, or very little, sort of technically. It was, in fact, the church's stomping on not stomping on, but the church finally said, look, all of this pagan astronomy, all this sort of rigid adherence to Aristotle's model and causes and Ptolemy and all this stuff, all of that, the church weakened the influence of that and expanded into what we would now call scientific kind of methodology. That's a little anachronistic, but the point is, it was in fact Christianity's influence in demystifying the pagan world and its authorities that allowed for Western civilization to let go of geocentrism and then do observations and get to heliocentrism. So that's the opposite of the story that you hear. Okay, this is related to technological advances. Because, of course, you'll hear that technology would be way more ahead if it weren't for the church or something like that. All wrong. So understand that in the ancient world, there's a lot of factors in this. For the ancient world, for the pagans, there was no pressing need to do science exactly. Like science and philosophy and intellectual things were the purview of the wealthy class, of the leisure class, because they had time to do these things. And so they thought that science, what they called natural philosophy, was entirely the domain of sort of abstract speculation. And they were separated from the slave class or the working class, who were the ones who worked with their hands. And so they never did any manual labor. So they didn't really have a relation to the empirical world, let's say, in that way. So a good example is, the ancient Greeks invented the steam engine. It's true. Yes, it's true. They invented the steam engine. Why no steampunk Greek world then? Because they didn't care. They didn't, like you see a new invention and you go, oh my gosh, we can market that maybe, or we can use it for more sophisticated or more efficient labor saving. But they didn't think that way, right? They were not, the intellectual leisure class didn't think in this way. They had slaves to do everything. Why do they need it? They had it as a curio. It was kind of like, oh, this is cool, and they did nothing with it, right? So it's not that there's a lack of technology. It's that the ideas, the worldview, the way you look at the world is going to inform what you see. So when you see a steam engine, you go, that can be valuable. And they go, that's cute. We have slaves. Didn't even occur to them. So what happened? Well, Christianity weakens this concept of slavery. Slavery almost, kind of Christian slavery, right, disappears in the Middle Ages. There's no such thing as that, really. Not in the sense that we mean it, and well, that's a complicated issue, right? There is slavery in the Middle Ages, but it's not a Christian institution. Not at all. Not in the way, and certainly not in the way that the Romans and the Greeks had slaves as a whole caste of society. Christianity ultimately weakens and dispenses with that notion because, of course, all people are made in the image of God, and so to own another person is a little weird. That's another topic, though, worth its own discussion. But so without slaves, is my point, without like a widespread understanding of like slavery is how the world works, which was true for the ancient world, now everybody needs to do work. Now everybody works with their hands. Now everybody is interested in labor-saving devices. So that's one factor. But the second factor is that all the gods and demons and spirits that ran reality and that controlled nature, they were all defeated by Christ. Remember from the last lecture, Christ defeated the old gods, and ushered in a new era of his rule. And that changes how you look at the world. Because if nature is fundamentally sort of a hostile thing that you kind of have to appease and perpetuate and work with and make sacrifices to because she's filled with all of these personalities, the gods and muses and spirits and stuff, then it's not really for you to go in there and tinker with and exploit nature. But once all that's demystified, and I'm not saying that Christians ceased to believe in those powers, only that those powers were subjugated by Christ and defeated, then suddenly the whole world of nature opens up to you to explore and to invent and to discover and to make things. Like it drives a different way of thinking about nature and about the world. So what happens? Technological explosion. I have another sort of long passage to read you about this because it's not something that you will probably think about. Certainly not something I thought about because we're modern people, right? So this is talking about the Middle Ages. This is all from David Bentley Hart's book, which I'll talk about later. Okay, the quote is, we're talking about technological innovation. In agriculture, architecture, engineering, machinery, astronomy, and the exploitation of new sources of power, the Middle Ages were marked by periods of invention far more prolonged, creative, and diverse than any known to Hellenistic, Roman, or Islamic culture. We may find it somewhat difficult now to appreciate the revolutionary implications of devices like, this is what I was talking about, like the heavy saddle with stirrups, the wheeled plow, the rigid horse collar, heavy armor, and the nailed horseshoe, but they allowed for the cultivation of soils that had never previously been genuinely arable, meaning farmable. And all this helped initiate a long period of Western military security, which is important, peace is important for prosperity, and did much to foster the kind of economic and demographic growth for want of which the Western Roman Empire had fallen into ruin. It requires no great labor of imagination, however, to grasp the significance of medieval developments in the use of water, wind, and coal to generate power. Water wheels appeared at the dawn of the High Middle Ages, for instance, first as simple water mills, but then, with the ever more sophisticated use of gears, as engines of mechanized industry, most particularly in the Cistercian monasteries of the 12th century and after. Presumably, you could have made water mills and gears in the ancient world. I don't know why you couldn't do that, but they didn't. That's my point. In these monasteries, water power was used not only to grind and sift grain, but also to drive hammers on camshafts for the fulling of wool, to prepare leather for tanning, to run oil presses and wood saws and the bellows of furnaces, and so on. The abundant production of wrought iron and finally of cast iron, the manufacture of cannon, constant improvements in the technology of mining, such as methods of pumping water, the trolley transport of ore and more stable mine shafts, the invention and refinement of the windmill, the development of sophisticated earthenware and glass glazing, the flying buttress and the Gothic arch, discoveries in the geometry of refraction, and the consequent perfection of magnifying lenses for eyeglasses, and of course for telescopes, the birth and continuous refinement of the mechanical clock, that's a medieval invention, the development of large seafaring vessels with rudders supported on stern posts and sails so rigid as to allow complete exploitation of the winds. Because remember, they rode almost everything in the ancient world. I mean, they had sails, but sailing technology hadn't improved too, either. The invention of the magnetic compass, all of these, among many more, were special achievements of Western medieval culture, and no previous culture had ever boasted technological advances of such scope and variety. So this is what I mean. Like a lot of those things you would never have thought of because we've moved past those things in our era. We have all kinds of even more sophisticated things and machines, and now we have automation, blah, blah, blah. But remember what it meant for them at the time. A lot of those things could have been invented and used in the ancient world, but they had no need to do that. Why would you have a windmill for grinding corn when we have slaves to grind corn? It just never would have occurred to them. And then they sit around sort of talking all the time. That's the leisure class for you. So this is a big deal. And probably the most supreme example of all of this, the special medieval invention that you should all be intimately familiar with by now is, of course, the university system. So the university is a medieval concept because it's based on this idea that all knowledge has one source, university, unity in diversity. Why is that possible? Because if there's one singular rational mind behind the entire cosmos, i.e. God, the supreme God, etc., and he created reality freely in an ordered way, then the universe is rational. That means the universe is explainable. And that means all knowledge, all learning has the same source, and therefore it's coherent. So you better start organizing all knowledge. At least that was the project of the medieval university. Let's start organizing all knowledge together and understanding how everything worked. People didn't get majors and specialize in the medieval university like the way that we do here. One person I was talking to called the modern university the multiversity, right? That's a phrase that's getting thrown around because it's not a unity in diversity, it's just a multitude in diversity, meaning everybody has all their little specifics, nuances, and specializations, let's say, and they don't talk to each other. Departments don't talk to each other, inter-departments don't talk to each other, people just specialize and ignore each other. That's been my experience and the experience of many people in the university system at the faculty level. And the university was not like this at all. These guys knew everything. They were polymaths. They did math, they did science, they did biblical studies, all together. Like when we check manuscripts from the medieval era, you might find somebody's treatise on geometry buried in the lecture notes of their commentary on Isaiah. Right? Because a lot of these manuscripts are class notes that were taken or written down afterward that people remembered. And so we'd be in some kind of a scriptural exegesis seminar situation. And I'm interpreting Isaiah. And then you bring something up and I say, you're right, we should review the basics of this sort of logic. And so then we'll go on a little side review talking about geometry or something or inductive logic or whatever, or predicate logic probably. And that would just be right in there, and everybody would be tracking with it. And then, okay, now we switch back to the biblical commentary. And they just move effortlessly between fields like that because everybody was learning everything, and that they were doing that project, organizing all knowledge on the understanding that the universe is rational. It all comes from one source, one rational mind, and therefore it can all be learned and known. And so there you have it, the university system. So that's a medieval invention, all about learning. It's not a modern thing. And one final thing that's really important about the university system is that it was really about genuine free inquiry and experimentation. It really was, because people would just argue and debate all kinds of things. They didn't censor topics. Compared to the medieval university system, the modern university system is much more censorship-oriented. You can't talk about certain things. You can't say certain things. There's all this wrong think that you're not allowed to say, and everybody's all stuck on their sort of propagandistic, sometimes at the worst, or ideologically motivated approaches to the subject. That wasn't true in the medieval university because they had no fear. There was a rational God that ordered everything, and they had reason, and they were going to figure it all out, and they did. So they learned everything. And they had amazing free reign to talk about any kind of idea, entertain all sorts of ideas. And what did that free inquiry create? Well, it created all the best minds of the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, let me see where we're going to get into this. Yeah, the Renaissance is really a result of the university system as the culmination of all of Christianity's accomplishments. The Renaissance didn't just drop out of the sky uncaused. The foundation for it was laid by centuries of medieval thinking and logic and studying and organizing and developments in logic and technology. All of that, what would you say? like all under pressure, waiting to explode, and that explosion was the Renaissance, or the multiple Renaissances, let's say, that happened in Europe because of this. And that kind of, it doesn't, let's put it this way, the Renaissance is not the beginning of the modern age as much as it's the culmination of the medieval era. That's how I would put it. And don't forget that all the Renaissance thinkers were Christians, not like, oh yeah, everybody was a Christian. Like, people kind of dismiss that fact. Like, these guys went to the university system, which was a Christian institution, predicated on Christian ideas and values. They were trained by all this stuff, and they came out and produced like an explosion of art and culture and technology. It's exactly what you would expect, in fact. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about, I mean, obviously there's a lot more you can research on this if you want, but that's the overview. But the last thing that I want to talk about is the special kind of relationship to the church and state that was going on in the medieval era, because people don't appreciate this. People think that the medieval era was some kind of weird theocracy where the Pope ran everything and told everybody what to do. And I think that part of it is that we can't really imagine, for reasons you'll see in the next lecture, we can't really imagine a world that's not just sort of oriented around power in this kind of explicit and centralized way, let's say. But the medieval world was different, and I just want to touch on that. So there's no theocracy in the sense that we mean that word now. Remember that first Christianity, well, let's see, how do I break this down? So the relationship between the church and the state, let's call it uneasy. So remember, first Christianity was a persecuted religion in the empire. Then it was adopted by the empire, but the empire was an independent thing. So the imperial system, right? So you had the imperial system, and then you had the episcopal system, meaning the system of bishops. And so the church and the state kind of checked and balanced each other. They were the checks and balances on each other. And let's see, what part of this is important for our purposes? It's a messy relationship. There are corrupt emperors and local rulers and principalities, and they get checked by the church. There are corrupt bishops and clergymen, obviously, because human beings have problems, generally speaking. Like, there's no perfect society, and there's no perfect government organization. That's not what I'm saying with all of this praising the accomplishments of the Middle Ages. I just want to give credit where credit is due. So there's corruption, but when there's corrupt state figures, the church checks them, and when there's corrupt church figures, the imperial system checks them. So there's a tension. There's a conversation that goes back and forth. And of course, you shouldn't be surprised when there are corrupt people in religious institutions any more than you should be surprised there are corrupt people in political institutions, because there are corrupt people everywhere, because people who are interested in power and control and who want to be selfish will use anything that's convenient to perpetrate the things that they want, right? And they'll tell you, oh, yes. Like if you've ever been around a chronic liar or somebody with psychopathic tendencies, they will just tell you whatever you want to hear, right? And they are not a good representative of whatever that is, right? They'll just lie through their teeth at you. So don't be so shocked that clergy can be corrupt. Of course they can. The question is not, is that going to happen? The question is, what's going to happen when this occurs? And so you get this church and state balance in the Middle Ages. And it's uneasy. Like I said, it's not a perfect system. There isn't a perfect system. I'll give you an example. So the Emperor Theodosius went to, well, it's a long story, but basically there was a violent uprising in one of these provinces in the empire, and Theodosius sent his men to put it down, and one thing led to another, and ended up like 7,000 people were massacred by his soldiers, and that's not what he intended, but it is what happened. And he was upset about this, but the bishop at the time, the bishop in Milan, Ambrose, would not let him get off the hook from this. He demanded that the emperor make a public confession of guilt and to apologize for what happened. Now, this had never happened before in history. This is fairly early. This had been 4th century. And so a bishop demanded that the emperor repent. And in fact, he wouldn't even let Theodosius into the church in Milan unless he came as a penitent. In other words, as somebody repenting. And what's remarkable is that I think a week later, after this statement was made, Theodosius, the emperor, did show up dressed in plain clothes, and he publicly asked for forgiveness and apologized, and then the bishop forgave him and gave him communion and all that stuff. So what's the point? The point is that wasn't something that would have been conceivable to people in the previous era. Maybe you're sensing a theme here. And so the fact that that can happen is good. I mean, imagine politicians today, they can just, there's no moral accountability. The people can get outraged and not vote for them next time, but there's nothing there that ties everybody together because, and we'll get to this later, but there's no moral center is what we'll end up talking about. And for the ancient world, there was. And so you had a state functioning to sort of run everything, but then you had the church present, involved in the conversation of society, and occasionally saying, hey, that's immoral. Let's back off of that. Let's not massacre an entire town. Good idea, right? So the church kind of had two functions. And one of them I'm already sort of talked at length about, which is that it served as a check to the state, which, has value. Let's not pretend it doesn't have value. And of course, the state can check the church, and that also has value. But it also provided unity across the whole empire. And that's a really big deal. It provides a kind of cultural, religious unity, a framework for everyone to share at a deep, fundamental level that allows for a diversity of different people groups and cultures to all live near each other or together, but still have the most important thing, their worldview, in common with each other. So that unity allows for diversity like this, if you have something central like that. And that's part of what was going on with the Roman Empire and the way that it was able to function by absorbing all these different cultures. But Christianity does it even better because it's a religion about radical human dignity, about the universality of all men and women and children and everyone at every station in Christ, that radical unity. So when Paul says famously in his letter to the Ephesians, I forget. In one of Paul's letters, he says there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And he's talking about the unity of everyone's dignity, their fundamental dignity, and their fundamental sharing, or let's say participation in the thing that we call humanity, which is radical. What else? I think that's it. That's all I want to do for today. To sum this part up, though, just to be perfectly clear about it, what's important and distinct about the Middle Ages, and what's different from our age and what you'll see in the next lecture, is that the church had a seat at the table of the discussion, how should we run society? That's really important. Because, well, we'll talk about it more later. But not a theocracy, not the church running everything, the church having an equal place at the table. This is two heads, right? The two heads of the two-headed eagle on the Byzantine flag. My understanding is that those two heads are the church and the state. One's not above the other. They're at the same level with each other because they're equals, and they both have something to say about how to run society. And that's very different than our sort of projected image of a theocracy. So how to run culture, how to run society, morality, religion, worldview has a part in that conversation. That's the medieval relationship between church and state. It's not theocratic in this way. That's something we'll get to later. So in the next lecture, we'll talk just a little bit about the sort of some of the nuances of the medieval era of the East and West and the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. And then we're going to move on to the rise of modernity, starting with the Reformation. And then we'll get into the last part of the lecture series, which is really trying to unpack how all of this leads to the development of modern civilization and what the modern values are and all that stuff. Until then.